The sunlight filtered through the silk curtains, casting golden patterns on the marble floor of the penthouse. From the 40th floor, Manhattan's skyline stretched endlessly, a breathtaking tableau of power and progress. Alexander Morgan stood silently at the window, his sharp, hawk-like gaze fixed on the horizon. At 55, Alexander was the epitome of success, charismatic, disciplined, and driven. But beneath the surface, there was a weariness to him, a shadow of regret that no wealth could erase. Behind him, the penthouse hummed with the quiet efficiency of a well-oiled machine. A housekeeper polished the already gleaming surfaces, and Samuel's nurse moved briskly through the corridors, preparing for the day's physical therapy session. This was the rhythm of Alexander's life, a meticulously managed routine that revolved around his son Samuel. It had been 2 decades since that fateful night, when a car accident left Samuel paralyzed from the waist down. At 25, Samuel was still a striking young man, with his father's sharp features and piercing blue eyes. But his wheelchair had become a cage, robbing him of the freedom and future he once had. Alexander blamed himself for the accident, a mistake that fueled his relentless devotion to Samuel's care. Every day began the same. Alexander would ensure that Samuel's breakfast was prepared exactly as he liked it: eggs scrambled softly, a side of toast cut into neat triangles, and freshly squeezed orange juice. Then he would oversee the physiotherapy sessions, watching as Samuel worked through the motions with a mixture of determination and resignation. But today, as Alexander passed by Samuel's room, something caught his attention. Through the half-open door, he saw Samuel watching a comedy show on television. It was a mundane moment, one that Alexander had witnessed countless times before. But then Samuel laughed, a carefree, genuine laugh, and his leg twitched ever so slightly. Alexander froze, his heart skipping a beat. Could it have been a muscle spasm? Or was it something more? Dismissing it as a trick of his mind, he continued with his day, though the image lingered in his thoughts. Later that evening, Alexander sat alone in his expansive study, surrounded by shelves of leather-bound books and accolades from his illustrious career. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid glinting under the warm light of the chandelier. As he stared at a photograph of himself and Samuel, taken before the accident, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. The guilt that had driven him for years began to stir, whispering questions he wasn't ready to confront. Had he done enough for Samuel? Had he missed something? And why, despite all the resources and care, did Samuel seem so distant from him? The door to the study opened, and Sarah Parker, Alexander's loyal assistant, entered with her usual grace. "Mr. Morgan," she began, her voice steady and professional, "here are the reports you requested." Alexander nodded, taking the files without a word. As Sarah turned to leave, he stopped her. "How is Samuel today?" he asked, his voice softer, almost hesitant. Sarah hesitated, a flicker of unease crossing her face. "He's doing well, sir. The physiotherapist said he's showing slight improvements in his upper body strength." Alexander nodded again, dismissing her with a polite thank you. But as the door closed behind her, the unease that had been gnawing at him all day grew stronger. He turned to his computer, logging into a private surveillance system he had installed years ago. Cameras hidden throughout the mansion allowed him to monitor every corner of the home. It was a precaution he had taken to ensure Samuel's safety. But tonight, he felt an unfamiliar sense of guilt as he clicked on the live feed of Samuel's room. Samuel was sitting in his wheelchair, watching TV as usual. But Alexander's trained eyes caught something peculiar. When Samuel thought no one was watching, his hands moved deftly, adjusting his chair's position without hesitation. The motions were fluid, natural, not the clumsy movements Alexander had grown accustomed to seeing during therapy. A chill ran down Alexander's spine. Was he imagining things? Or was there more to Samuel's condition than he had been led to believe? The questions swirled in his mind, and for the first time in years, Alexander felt a spark of doubt, not about his love for Samuel, but about the story they had both been living. As the night deepened, and the city outside his window glittered with life, Alexander knew one thing for certain. He had to find out the truth, and he had to do it soon. The Morgan mansion hummed with its usual rhythm the following morning. Staff moved quietly through the hallways, a well-practiced dance of efficiency and discretion. Yet, there was an unusual tension in the air, a subtle shift that none could quite place, but all could feel. Alexander Morgan sat at the head of the breakfast table, his face a mask of calm control, as Samuel wheeled himself into the room. The familiar sound of his son's chair rolling across the polished floor made Alexander glance up, forcing a smile. "Good morning, son," he greeted, his voice even. "Morning, Dad," Samuel replied, his tone casual, though he avoided his father's gaze. The meal passed in relative silence, save for the occasional clink of cutlery against fine china. But Alexander's mind was far from the table. His thoughts lingered on the surveillance footage from the previous night, replaying Samuel's movements in his mind. Was it possible that his son had been hiding his progress? And if so, why? Later that morning, Sarah Parker entered Alexander's office, carrying a leather-bound planner and a stack of documents. At 40, Sarah was poised and professional, her every action deliberate. She had been Alexander's assistant for over a decade, a trusted confidant, and an invaluable asset to both his personal and professional life. "Mr. Morgan," she began, placing the documents neatly on his desk. "The physiotherapist has just arrived. Should I ask her to wait in the lounge, or will you be joining the session today?" Alexander hesitated. "I'll join," he said finally, rising from his chair. "I want to observe Samuel's progress firsthand." Sarah nodded, but didn't move to leave. Instead, she lingered, her expression uncharacteristically hesitant. "Is there something else, Sarah?" Alexander asked, his sharp gaze meeting hers. "It's probably nothing," she said slowly. "But I've noticed Samuel seems different lately. Happier almost. He talks more with the staff, laughs more. I thought it might be worth mentioning." Alexander's jaw tightened, though he nodded curtly. "Thank you, Sarah. I'll keep that in mind." As Sarah left, Alexander felt the weight of her words settle on him. Was her observation tied to what he'd seen on the surveillance footage? If Samuel truly had regained some of his mobility, why would he keep it a secret? In the therapy room, Lucy Mendoza adjusted the straps on Samuel's legs, her fingers moving deftly as she prepared him for the day's exercises. At 28, Lucy was young and driven, her passion for physical therapy stemming from a personal tragedy in her past, a brother who had been paralyzed in a similar accident and never recovered. "Okay, Samuel," she said, her voice cheerful yet professional. "Let's start with some leg stretches. Remember to focus on your breathing." Samuel nodded, his usual joking demeanor subdued. He glanced at the doorway where Alexander had just entered, his imposing presence immediately filling the room. "Dad," Samuel said, surprised. "I didn't know you'd be watching today." Alexander crossed his arms, leaning against the doorframe. "I wanted to see how you're progressing. Don't mind me." Lucy offered a polite smile and continued her work, unaware of the tension between father and son. As she guided Samuel through the exercises, Alexander watched closely, his eyes narrowing, whenever Samuel's movements seemed too natural, too controlled. Good job, Samuel," Lucy said, after finishing the session. "You're improving steadily." Alexander's gaze flicked to her. How much improvement are we talking about? Lucy hesitated, sensing the sharpness in his tone. It's hard to say definitively, Mr. Morgan. Progress can be inconsistent with cases like Samuel's, but he's showing good signs of muscle retention and responsiveness. Alexander nodded, his face unreadable. Thank you, Lucy. That will be all for now. As she left, Alexander turned to Samuel, his expression softening slightly. How are you feeling, son? Same as usual, Samuel replied, shrugging. The therapy helps, but you know how it is. Do I? Alexander said, his voice carefully neutral. I wonder if there's more to it than that. Samuel's brow furrowed, but before he could respond, Alexander placed a hand on his shoulder. I just want what's best for you, he said softly. Never forget that. That evening, as the household settled into its nighttime routine, Alexander sat alone in his study once again. The events of the day had only deepened his suspicions, and he knew he couldn't ignore them any longer. He opened his laptop, accessing the hidden surveillance program. Multiple windows popped up, displaying live feeds from around the mansion. Alexander clicked on the feed from Samuel's room, leaning forward as he watched his son reading in bed. After a few moments, Samuel put the book down and glanced around the room. Seeing no one, he shifted in his wheelchair and reached for a nearby shelf, his movements smooth and deliberate. Then, to Alexander's shock, Samuel placed his hands on the armrests of his chair and began to push himself up. It was slow and shaky, but the effort was undeniable. Samuel stood on trembling legs, taking one hesitant step forward before collapsing back into the chair, panting but smiling triumphantly. Alexander's heart pounded in his chest as he paused the footage, his mind racing. Samuel could walk, perhaps not fully, but enough to prove that his paralysis wasn't as severe as they had believed. Why hadn't he said anything? What was he hiding? His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Quickly closing the laptop, Alexander called out, "Come in." Sarah entered, holding a tray with a steaming cup of tea. "I thought you might need this," she said, placing it on his desk. Her sharp eyes caught the tension in his posture. "Is everything all right, Mr. Morgan?" Alexander forced a smile. "Just a long day, Sarah. Thank you for this." As she left, Alexander leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the dark screen of his laptop. He had a choice to make: confront Samuel directly or continue gathering evidence. Either way, he couldn't shake the feeling that uncovering the truth would change everything, for better or worse. The following morning, Alexander made his decision. After instructing the staff to leave the mansion for the day, he installed additional hidden cameras in key areas, determined to catch every detail of Samuel's behavior. As he worked, a strange mixture of emotions coursed through him. Love for his son warred with anger at the deception, and beneath it all, a growing fear of what else might be uncovered. For the first time in years, Alexander Morgan, the unshakable titan of business, felt the ground beneath him begin to shift. The morning sunlight filtered through the sheer curtains of the Morgan mansion, casting soft patterns on the marble floors. The sprawling estate, a symbol of power and wealth, seemed quieter than usual, as if holding its breath for the storm brewing within. Alexander Morgan sat in his private study, his hands clasped tightly on the desk, as he replayed the surveillance footage for what felt like the 100th time. The sight of Samuel standing, shaky, yes, but undeniably upright, had shaken him to his core. He had always prided himself on being a man who could read people, anticipate their moves, but his own son had managed to deceive him. The intercom buzzed, breaking his reverie. "Mr. Morgan, the board meeting is set to begin in 20 minutes, Sarah's efficient voice reminded him. Alexander closed his laptop, his jaw tightening. "Thank you, Sarah. I'll be there shortly." The boardroom of Morgan Enterprises buzzed with conversation as executives discussed the looming merger with Global Corporation. Richard Foster, Alexander's right-hand man, stood at the head of the table, reviewing the latest reports. "Gentlemen," Alexander's voice cut through the chatter as he entered the room. Instantly, the room fell silent. He took his seat, his expression unreadable. "Let's begin." As the meeting progressed, Alexander found his attention drifting. Numbers and projections blurred together as his thoughts returned to Samuel. The company, the wealth, the power. None of it seemed to matter in the face of what he had seen. By the time the meeting concluded, he was no closer to answers, only deeper in doubt. Back at the mansion, Samuel wheeled himself into the living room, where Lucy was setting up for their therapy session. She greeted him with her usual warm smile. "Ready for another round?" Samuel chuckled. "Let's see if I can break my record today." As they worked through the exercises, Lucy couldn't help but notice Samuel's focus. He pushed harder, his movements more deliberate than usual. "You're really pushing yourself today," she remarked. Samuel shrugged, a mischievous glint in his eye. "Maybe I've got something to prove." In the corner of the room, hidden behind an ornate bookshelf, a camera recorded every moment. That evening, Alexander sat alone in the dimly lit study, nursing a glass of scotch. The surveillance footage from Samuel's session with Lucy played on his laptop. He watched closely, his sharp eyes noting every detail. The subtle shifts in Samuel's posture, the way he flexed his legs when he thought no one was watching. It all painted a picture Alexander was struggling to reconcile. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. "Come in," he called, his voice rough. It was Sarah holding a folder. "These are the latest reports from the financial team," she said, placing them in his desk. Her gaze lingered on him, concern flickering in her eyes. "Are you sure everything's all right, Mr. Morgan?" Alexander nodded curtly. "Thank you, Sarah. That will be all." As she left, he glanced at the folder, but made no move to open it. Instead, he turned his attention back to the footage. The more he watched, the more his emotions churned. Pride at Samuel's apparent progress, anger at the secrecy, and an unshakable sadness that his son hadn't trusted him enough to share the truth. The next morning, Alexander decided it was time for answers. He found Samuel in the library, engrossed in a book. "Samuel," he began, his tone carefully neutral. Samuel looked up, surprised. "What's up, Dad?" Alexander sat down across from him, studying his son intently. "I've been thinking about your therapy. Lucy seems impressed with your progress." Samuel smiled faintly. "She's a great therapist." "She is," Alexander agreed, leaning forward. "But I have to ask, son, are you being completely honest with me about your condition?" Samuel's smile faltered. "What do you mean?" Alexander's gaze hardened. "I mean, I've seen things, small movements, signs that suggest your paralysis might not be as severe as we thought." Samuel stiffened, his hands gripping the armrests of his wheelchair. "Dad, I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie to me, Samuel," Alexander said, his voice rising. "I've always been honest with you. I deserve the same in return." Samuel's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Finally, Alexander stood. "If you won't tell me the truth, I'll find it myself." He left the library, his frustration mounting with every step. That night, Alexander revisited the surveillance footage, determined to uncover the full extent of Samuel's deception. Hours passed as he combed through the recordings, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. And then he found it. A clip from 2 nights ago, showed Samuel in his room. He had waited until the house was quiet before locking the door and carefully standing from his wheelchair. His movements were slow and deliberate, each step a struggle, but the determination on his face was unmistakable. Alexander paused the footage, his hands trembling. For a moment, he felt an overwhelming surge of pride. His son was walking, defying the odds, proving the doctors wrong. But the pride was quickly overshadowed by anger. Why hadn't Samuel told him? Why had he chosen to keep this a secret? The sound of his phone ringing jolted him from his thoughts. It was Dr. Ramirez. "Alexander," the doctor began, his tone serious. "We need to talk about your latest test results. Can you come in tomorrow?" Alexander's chest tightened. "Is it bad?" "It's concerning," Ramirez admitted. "We need to run more tests to be sure." Alexander hung up, his mind spinning. The prospect of his own declining health only deepened his frustration with Samuel's secrecy. If his time was limited, he couldn't afford to waste it on lies. The following day, Alexander met with Dr. Ramirez, who confirmed his worst fears: a rare progressive illness that would likely give him only a few more years at best. As he left the clinic, Alexander's resolve hardened. He would confront Samuel, demand the truth, and set things right, whatever the cost. That evening, Alexander called Samuel into his study. When his son arrived, Alexander wasted no time. "I know you can walk, Samuel," he said bluntly. Samuel froze, his expression a mixture of shock and guilt. "Dad, no more excuses," Alexander interrupted, his voice cold. "I've seen the footage. I know you've been hiding this from me." Samuel's shoulders sagged, and he looked away. "I was going to tell you," he said quietly. "I just wasn't ready." "Not ready?" Alexander's voice rose. "Do you have any idea what I've been through? The sacrifices I've made to ensure you had the best care, the best life." "I didn't ask for this life," Samuel shot back, his voice shaking. "Do you think it's easy living under your shadow, constantly feeling like I'll never measure up?" Alexander stared at his son, his anger fading as the weight of Samuel's words sank in. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Alexander sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I just want to understand, son. Help me understand." Samuel hesitated before finally meeting his father's gaze. "I'll try." And for the first time in years, father and son began to bridge the chasm that had grown between them. The golden morning light spilled over the sprawling Morgan estate, painting it with a warmth that belied the tension within its walls. Alexander Morgan stood on the balcony of his bedroom, staring out over the meticulously landscaped gardens. His mind churned with the revelations of the past days, his heart heavy with a mix of betrayal and regret. Downstairs, the house was already bustling. Sarah Parker, ever efficient, oversaw the staff as they prepared for the day. She paused briefly, her sharp eyes catching a glimpse of Samuel in his wheelchair near the study. His face was etched with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Was it guilt, defiance, or perhaps a mix of both? "Good morning, Samuel," she greeted, her tone warm but professional. "Morning, Sarah," he replied absently, barely looking up. She hesitated for a moment before walking away, her mind filing away the interaction for later consideration. Over a decade in Alexander's service had taught her that nothing in this household was ever as it seemed. In the boardroom of Morgan Enterprises, the tension was palpable. Richard Foster, Alexander's trusted lieutenant, was presenting the latest developments regarding the company's ongoing merger with Global Corporation. His voice was steady, his demeanor calm, but beneath the surface, he was acutely aware of the precarious position they were in. Alexander listened intently, his sharp mind analyzing every detail. but his thoughts kept drifting back to Samuel. The merger was critical to the company's future, but for the first time in his life, Alexander found himself questioning the value of it all. "Richard," he interrupted, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "What's the real reason Global Corporation is hesitating?" Richard hesitated, a flicker of unease crossing his face. "There have been concerns raised about the company's long-term stability." Alexander's eyes narrowed. "Concerns raised by whom?" "I'm not sure yet," Richard admitted, "but I'll find out." "See that you do," Alexander said firmly. "This merger is non-negotiable." As the meeting adjourned, Alexander lingered behind, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that something larger was at play, something that went beyond the merger or Samuel's secrets. Back at the mansion, Lucy Mendoza was finishing Samuel's therapy session. She watched him carefully as he completed a series of exercises, her keen eyes noting every movement. "You're improving," she said, her tone encouraging. "Your balance is getting better." Samuel smiled faintly. "Thanks, Lucy. I couldn't have done it without you." She hesitated before speaking again, her voice softer. "Samuel, can I ask you something?" He glanced at her warily. "Sure." "Why haven't you told your father the full truth?" she asked, her gaze steady. Samuel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's complicated. He has expectations. I didn't want to disappoint him." Lucy frowned. "But don't you think he'd be proud of you for making progress?" "Maybe," Samuel admitted. "But it's not just about that. It's about everything. This house, the company, the legacy. It's overwhelming." Lucy nodded, understanding his hesitation, but still feeling uneasy. She wanted to push him to open up, but she knew better than to press too hard. That evening, Alexander called Richard to his office. The room was dimly lit, the only sound the faint ticking of the antique clock on the wall. "Close the door," Alexander said, gesturing for Richard to sit. Once they were alone, Alexander leaned forward, his expression serious. "What aren't you telling me about Global Corporation?" Richard hesitated, his fingers drumming against the armrest of his chair. "There's been some chatter." "Chatter?" Alexander's voice was sharp. "Spit it out, Richard." "There are rumors that someone within the company is feeding information to our competitors," Richard admitted reluctantly. "I'm looking into it, but I haven't found any concrete evidence yet." Alexander's jaw tightened. "Find out who it is, and when you do, I want them dealt with." Richard nodded, his mind already working on how to uncover the mole. But as he left the office, a nagging doubt crept into his thoughts. How deep did the rot within Morgan Enterprises go? In the quiet solitude of his study, Alexander poured himself a glass of scotch and settled into his chair. His thoughts were a whirlwind. Samuel's deception, the merger, the possibility of betrayal within his company. It all felt like too much to bear. He picked up a silver-framed photograph from his desk, the image of a younger Samuel smiling back at him. The memory of that day, before the accident, before everything changed, brought a pang of sadness to his chest. "Where did we go wrong?" he murmured aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. Meanwhile, Samuel was in his room, staring at the text message on his phone. It was from an unknown number. "There are things you don't know about your family. Meet me at the cafe on 8th Street, tomorrow, at 2 p.m. if you want answers." His heart pounded as he read and reread the message. Who could it be? And what did they know about his family? The next morning, Samuel woke with a sense of unease. He couldn't shake the feeling that the message was the beginning of something much larger. But he resolved to find out the truth, no matter the cost. At the same time, Alexander met with Dr. Ramirez to discuss the results of his latest tests. The doctor's expression was grave as he explained the prognosis. "Alexander, I won't sugarcoat this," Dr. Ramirez said. "Your condition is serious. We need to start treatment immediately." Alexander nodded, his expression unreadable. "How much time do I have?" "With aggressive treatment, maybe a year or two," the doctor said. "Without it, 6 months at best." The news hit Alexander like a blow, but he didn't let it show. Instead, he thanked the doctor and left the clinic, his mind racing. He had always prided himself on being in control, but now, for the first time, he felt powerless. That evening, the Morgan mansion was unusually quiet. Alexander retreated to his study, poring over documents and surveillance footage. Samuel, meanwhile, prepared to leave for the mysterious meeting at the cafe. As Samuel wheeled himself out the front door, he paused, glancing back at the house. He felt a pang of guilt, but he pushed it aside. He needed answers. At the cafe, Samuel sat nervously, his eyes scanning the room for the sender of the message. A woman in her late 30s approached his table, her expression guarded. "Samuel Morgan?" she asked. He nodded. "Who are you?" "Someone who knows the truth," she said, sliding a manila envelope across the table. "Everything you need to know is in there." Before he could respond, she stood and walked away, leaving him alone with the envelope. With trembling hands, he opened it and began to read. What he found inside would change everything he thought he knew about his family. The morning light filtered through the heavy drapes of the Morgan mansion, casting long shadows across the luxurious furnishings. Samuel sat alone in his room, the envelope from the cafe open before him on the desk. The documents inside painted a picture he couldn't reconcile with the life he thought he knew. The papers detailed not only his adoption, but also the origins of Morgan Enterprises, shadowed by illegal dealings orchestrated by his grandfather, Ernest Morgan. Worse still, it hinted at a vast web of secrecy involving his father, Alexander, and even Sarah, the trusted assistant who had been a constant presence in their lives. His mind was a storm of emotions: betrayal, anger, and confusion. The sound of footsteps outside his door snapped him out of his thoughts. It was Lucy, carrying her usual therapy equipment. "Samuel?" she called, knocking softly. "Are you ready for today's session?" He hesitated before responding, his voice heavy with frustration. "Come in." Lucy entered the room, immediately sensing the tension. Samuel's usually warm demeanor was replaced by a cold, distant stare. She set her equipment down and approached cautiously. "What's going on?" she asked gently. "You seem different today." Samuel glanced at the envelope, but didn't say anything. After a moment, he gestured toward the chair across from him. "Sit it." Lucy obeyed, her heart racing. Something about Samuel's tone unsettled her. He slid the envelope toward her, his expression unreadable. "Read it," he said. Lucy hesitated but eventually opened the envelope and skimmed the contents. Her eyes widened as she took in the information. "Samuel, where did you get this?" "That doesn't matter," he replied sharply. "What matters is whether it's true." Lucy set the papers down, her hands trembling. I don't know everything, but some of this, it aligns with things I've noticed over the years." Samuel's gaze hardened. "You knew something, didn't you?" Lucy's silence was answer enough. Samuel stood abruptly, his wheelchair forgotten for the moment. "You lied to me too." "I didn't lie," Lucy said quickly, standing to face him. I just didn't know how to tell you. I wanted to protect you." "Protect me?" Samuel laughed bitterly. "Everyone says that. My father, Sarah, and now you. But all you've done is keep me in the dark." Downstairs, Alexander sat in his study, staring at the same photograph he had held the night before. The weight of the truth was suffocating, but he knew he couldn't avoid it much longer. A knock at the door broke his reverie. "Come in," he said, his voice weary. It was Sarah, her usual composed expression, replaced with one of concern. "Alexander, we need to talk." He motioned for her to sit, though his eyes remained fixed on the photograph. "What is it, Sarah?" She hesitated before speaking. "I've been noticing things, small but concerning. Samuel seems distant, and Richard, well, I don't trust him." Alexander finally looked up, his gaze sharp. "What do you mean?" "There have been inconsistencies in the financial reports," Sarah explained. "And Richard has been evasive. I think he knows more about global corporations' hesitations than he's letting on." Alexander leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. "Keep an eye on him. If he's hiding something, I want to know." That evening, tensions reached a breaking point. During dinner, Samuel confronted Alexander in front of everyone. "Why didn't you tell me I was adopted?" Samuel asked, his voice cold and accusatory. The question hung in the air, silencing the room. Alexander set down his fork, his expression unreadable. "Who told you?" he asked quietly. "It doesn't matter," Samuel shot back. "I want to hear it from you." Alexander took a deep breath, his hands clenching into fists beneath the table. "Yes, you were adopted, but that doesn't change anything. You're my son, Samuel." "Doesn't change anything." Samuel's voice rose. "My whole life has been a lie. And it's not just that. I know about the company, about Grandpa's dirty money. Were you planning to tell me any of it? Or was I supposed to live in ignorance forever?" Emily, who had been silent until now, placed a trembling hand on Samuel's arm. "Samuel, please, your father was only trying to protect you." "Protect me? By lying to me?" Samuel shook his head. "I can't do this." He turned and left the table, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. The sound echoed in the tense silence that followed. In his room, Samuel packed a small bag, his mind set on leaving the mansion. He couldn't stay under the same roof as people he no longer trusted. Lucy found him moments before he slipped out the door. "Samuel, where are you going?" she asked, panic in her voice. "Anywhere but here," he replied curtly. "Please don't do this," Lucy pleaded. "Running away won't solve anything." Samuel paused, his expression softening slightly. "I need time, Lucy. Time to figure out who I am and what I want. I can't do that here." Before she could respond, he was gone, leaving her standing in the doorway, her heart heavy with worry. Meanwhile, at Morgan Enterprises, Richard sat alone in his office, a tumbler of whiskey in his hand. He stared at a series of documents on his desk, his mind racing. He had been careful, meticulously so. But now, with the merger falling apart and Alexander growing suspicious, he knew his time was running out. He picked up his phone and made a call. "We need to move up the timeline," he said. "I don't care if it's risky. If Alexander finds out, we're done." Unbeknownst to him, Sarah had been listening from just outside the door. Her heart raced as she pieced together what she had just heard. The next morning, Alexander called a family meeting. He stood at the head of the table, his expression grim. "Things need to change," he began. "This family has been built on lies and secrets for far too long. It's time to face the truth, no matter how painful it is." He turned to Sarah. "Start an internal audit of the company. I want every account, every transaction scrutinized." Sarah nodded, her respect for Alexander renewed, but she couldn't shake the unease that lingered from what she had overheard. As the meeting ended, Samuel returned to the mansion, His resolve hardened. He walked into the study, where Alexander was poring over documents. "Dad," Samuel said, his voice steady. "We need to talk." Alexander looked up, surprised but relieved. "Of course, son." "I'm not here to forgive you," Samuel clarified. "But I want to know everything. No more lies." Alexander nodded, his heart heavy. "You deserve the truth, Samuel. About the company, about our family, about everything." And so, the long-buried secrets of the Morgan dynasty began to unravel, setting the stage for a confrontation that would test the bonds of family like never before. The air inside the Morgan mansion was thick with tension as the morning sun bathed the grand interiors in muted light. Samuel sat stiffly on the leather armchair in the study, his eyes locked on Alexander, who paced the room with deliberate slowness. Emily lingered in the doorway, her expression a mixture of guilt and fear. Samuel broke the silence first, his voice steady but sharp. "No more excuses, no more deflections. I want the truth, all of it. About my adoption, the company, Grandpa, everything." Alexander stopped pacing, turning to face his son. His gaze was heavy with remorse, yet resolute. "You deserve to know everything. But understand, Samuel, the truth is not simple. It's ugly, and it's painful." Alexander began to recount the story, his voice filled with a mixture of regret and weariness. "When I was younger, your grandfather, Ernest Morgan, was a formidable man. He built Morgan Enterprises into what it is today, but his methods were unconventional." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "He had connections, dangerous ones. Politicians, mob bosses, you name it. He used the company to launder money, to hide illicit deals, and he made it clear that anyone who opposed him would face dire consequences." Samuel listened intently, his hands clenched into fists. "And you went along with it?" Alexander nodded slowly. "At first, I didn't know. I thought I was inheriting a legitimate business empire. But when I discovered the truth, I was already too deep. Your grandfather controlled everything. My career, my future, even my personal life." Emily stepped forward then, her voice trembling. "Oh, he controlled mine too, Samuel. When I found out I was pregnant with you, Ernest gave me an ultimatum. I could either leave quietly, or he'd destroy me. And you." Samuel's eyes widened in shock. "So, you left? You gave me up?" "I thought it was the only way to protect you," Emily admitted, tears streaming down her face. "But Alexander found out. He tracked you down and adopted you in secret, against Ernest's wishes." Samuel stood abruptly, pacing the room, as the weight of the revelations threatened to crush him. "So, my entire life has been a lie. The father I looked up to, the family I trusted, it was all built on secrets and corruption." "It wasn't all a lie," Alexander said quietly. "The love we feel for you, Samuel, that's real. It always has been." "Love?" Samuel scoffed, turning to face his parents. "How can you say that after everything you've done?" Emily stepped closer, her voice soft but firm. "Because it's the truth. And we're telling you now, even if it risks everything." Meanwhile, across town, Lucy sat at her small desk, poring over files she had secretly obtained. The documents detailed discrepancies in Samuel's medical records, along with payments made to a private clinic under the Morgan family's name. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Sarah. "Lucy." Sarah's voice came through, low and urgent. "I think we need to talk. I've uncovered something about Richard." "Richard?" Lucy asked, frowning. "What about him?" "He's been hiding transactions," Sarah said. "I have proof that he's been embezzling company funds." Lucy's heart raced. "Meet me at the cafe in an hour," We need to figure out our next steps. That evening, Alexander called an emergency board meeting at Morgan Enterprises. The room was filled with tension as board members whispered among themselves, casting wary glances at Alexander and Richard. Alexander stood at the head of the table, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "I've called this meeting because I've uncovered a serious issue within our company. Richard Foster has been siphoning funds into private accounts." The room erupted into chaos as Richard shot to his feet. "This is absurd. You have no proof." "I have plenty of proof," Sarah interjected, stepping forward. She placed a stack of documents on the table, her expression unyielding. "These transactions lead straight to you." Richard's face turned pale as he glanced at the papers. "You don't understand," he stammered. "I was trying to protect the company. If the truth about Ernest's dealings came out, we'd all be ruined." "That doesn't justify stealing," Alexander said, his voice cold. "You betrayed me, Richard. And worse, you betrayed this company." Back at the mansion, Samuel sat in his room, staring at the documents Lucy had given him. Among them was a letter from Emily, written years ago, but never sent. It detailed her reasons for leaving and her hopes that Alexander would give Samuel the life she couldn't. Overwhelmed, Samuel broke down, tears streaming down his face. He had spent so many years feeling lost, believing he didn't belong. But now, despite the lies and betrayals, he realized something. His parents, flawed as they were, had fought to give him a chance at a better life. He picked up his phone and called Lucy. "I need to see you," he said, his voice trembling. "There's something I need to understand." As Samuel and Lucy met at the cafe, the tension between them was palpable. Samuel slid the letter across the table, his expression unreadable. "Did you know about this?" he asked. Lucy hesitated before nodding. "I found it while investigating your medical records. I didn't want to hide it from you, but I didn't know how to tell you." Samuel's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, his phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. He answered cautiously. "Samuel Morgan?" The voice on the other end said. "We need to talk. I have information about your grandfather, and it changes everything." Samuel's heart raced as he gripped the phone. "Who is this?" "You'll find out soon enough," the voice replied. "Meet me tomorrow at noon, at the old warehouse on 5th Street, and come alone." As the call ended, Samuel exchanged a glance with Lucy. "Looks like the truth isn't done with us yet," he said grimly. The morning sun filtered through the half-closed blinds of Samuel's apartment, casting long streaks of light across the floor. He sat on the edge of his bed, the letter from Emily still clutched in his hand. His thoughts were a whirlwind of anger, confusion, and a faint glimmer of understanding. Despite everything, one thing was clear. He couldn't let the lies of the past define him. Samuel stood up, his movements slow but deliberate. He went to the closet, retrieving a pair of sneakers that had been collecting dust for years. It had been a long time since he wore them, a long time since he allowed himself to believe he could walk without a wheelchair. As he laced them up, he caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror. He saw not the paralyzed victim he had once believed himself to be, but a man determined to reclaim his life. With a deep breath, he stood, his legs shaky but holding firm. Step by step, he crossed the room, his confidence growing with each stride. Later that morning, Samuel met Lucy at a park near his apartment. The tension between them was palpable as they sat on a bench beneath the shade of a towering oak tree. "Thank you for coming," Lucy began, her voice hesitant. "I know I've made mistakes, Samuel. I should have told you what I knew sooner." Samuel studied her face, searching for any hint of insincerity. "Why didn't you?" he asked, his tone more curious than accusatory. I was scared, Lucy admitted. I thought, if you found out the truth all at once, it would break you. But I realize now that I underestimated you. You're stronger than I gave you credit for. Samuel nodded slowly. I don't know if I can forgive you, Lucy, but I appreciate your honesty. She reached out, placing a tentative hand on his arm. I want to help you, Samuel. Whatever you need, I'm here. Their conversation was interrupted by the buzz of Samuel's phone. It was a reminder of the meeting, arranged by the anonymous caller. Samuel glanced at Lucy, his expression a mix of determination and caution. Someone called me last night, he said. They claim to have information about my grandfather, about the company. Lucy's brow furrowed. Do you trust them? No, Samuel admitted. But I need answers. Lucy hesitated, then nodded. You're not going alone. I'll be there. The old warehouse on 5th Street was a relic of a bygone era, its rusted exterior and broken windows a stark contrast to the glittering skyline in the distance. Samuel and Lucy arrived just before noon, their steps echoing on the cracked pavement. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint smell of oil. A man stepped out of the shadows, his face partially obscured by a baseball cap. Samuel Morgan, the man greeted, his voice low and gravelly. You've got guts coming here. Who are you? Samuel demanded. The man smirked. Let's just say I used to work for your grandfather. I know things that could destroy Morgan Enterprises. Samuel exchanged a wary glance with Lucy. Why tell me this now? Because I'm tired of keeping quiet, the man said. And because I think you deserve to know the truth. He handed Samuel a folder. Everything you need is in here. Bank records, contracts, even letters your grandfather wrote. It's all there. Samuel opened the folder, his eyes scanning the damning evidence. His stomach churned as he realized the extent of Ernest Morgan's crimes. The weight of the revelation settled heavily on Samuel as he and Lucy left the warehouse. For years, he had seen himself as a victim, but now he realized he had the power to change the narrative. I can't let this continue, Samuel said, his voice firm. My grandfather's actions hurt too many people. It's time to make things right. Lucy placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. You don't have to do it alone. That evening, Samuel returned to the Morgan mansion. He found Alexander in the study, staring out the window with a glass of whiskey in hand. We need to talk, Samuel said, his voice steady. Alexander turned, his expression weary. What is it, son? Samuel set the folder on the desk. This, all of it? I know everything, Dad. About Grandpa. About the company. It has to stop. Alexander's face paled as he opened the folder. The damning evidence stared back at him, each page a reminder of the family's dark legacy. You don't understand, Alexander began. If this gets out, it'll destroy us. Maybe we deserve to be destroyed, Samuel shot back. But we can't keep living like this. We need to face the truth, no matter the cost. Over the next few weeks, Samuel threw himself into rebuilding the family's reputation. He worked tirelessly with Lucy, Sarah, and even Emily to uncover the full extent of Ernest's crimes and devise a plan to make amends. He reached out to the victims of Ernest's schemes, offering restitution to and public apologies. The media quickly took notice, painting Samuel as a man seeking redemption for his family's sins. One evening, as Samuel sat in his apartment reviewing files, he received a call from Emily. I'm proud of you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I know it hasn't been easy, but you're doing the right thing. Thanks, Mom, Samuel replied, the word feeling both foreign and comforting. I just hope it's enough. As Samuel hung up, a notification popped up on his computer. It was an encrypted email with no sender address. The subject line read, "There's more you need to know." Samuel hesitated before opening it. The email contained a single sentence. "Meet me at the old park. Tomorrow at midnight. Come alone." His heart raced as he stared at the screen. The journey of redemption was far from over, and it seemed the truth still had more to reveal. The Morgan mansion, usually a sanctuary of luxury and order, had become a hub of chaos and tension. News of the revelations about Ernest Morgan's dark dealings and the company's tainted legacy had sent shockwaves through the household. Samuel, Alexander, and Emily were forced to confront truths they had long buried, each grappling with their own guilt, anger, and confusion. Samuel sat in the grand dining room, staring at the untouched coffee in front of him. The room was eerily quiet, save for the ticking of the antique grandfather clock. Emily entered, her face pale and drawn. "We need to talk," she said softly, sitting across from him. Samuel didn't look up. "Talk about what? The lies? The secrets? Or the fact that my entire life has been built on a foundation of deceit?" Emily flinched at his harsh tone. "I know you're angry, and you have every right to be, but I want you to understand that everything I did was to protect you." "Protect me?" Samuel's voice rose. "By hiding the truth? By letting me believe I was someone I'm not?" Emily's eyes filled with tears. "I was scared, Samuel. Your grandfather was a powerful man, and he would have done anything to keep his secrets buried." Samuel shook his head, his frustration mounting. "You're just as complicit as he was, Mom." The tension between Samuel and Emily was only part of the growing rift. Alexander, too, was struggling to maintain control of the situation. Late that evening, he called a family meeting in the study. Emily, Samuel, Sarah, and even Lucy gathered, their faces reflecting the gravity of the moment. Alexander stood by the fireplace, his expression grim. "We need to address the elephant in the room," he began. "The truth is out, and the world is watching us. We have to decide how to move forward." Samuel crossed his arms, his jaw clenched. "The only way forward is to come clean. All of it. No more lies." Alexander's eyes narrowed. "You think it's that simple? The fallout could ruin us, Samuel. The company, the family name, it would all be gone." "Maybe it should be," Samuel retorted. "Maybe it's time we stop hiding behind the Morgan name and start making things right." Emily interjected, her voice shaky. "Samuel's right, Alexander. We can't keep living like this. It's destroying us." Alexander sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. "And what about the employees? The people who depend on this company? Are we willing to sacrifice them for our redemption?" Lucy spoke up for the first time. "There's a way to make amends without completely dismantling the company. We need to focus on transparency and restitution." The room fell into silence as everyone absorbed her words. Finally, Alexander nodded. "Fine. But if we do this, we do it my way. No rash decisions." As the family grappled with their internal conflicts, the legal ramifications of their actions loomed large. One morning, a sleek black car pulled up to the mansion, and two officers stepped out. Sarah greeted them at the door, her professional demeanor masking the anxiety she felt. "Good morning, officers. How can I help you?" she asked. "We're here to speak with Mr. Alexander Morgan and Mr. Samuel Morgan regarding an ongoing investigation into Morgan Enterprises," one officer replied. Alexander appeared moments later, his face a mask of composure. "What's this about?" "We've received information linking your company to financial irregularities and potential money laundering activities. the officer explained. Samuel stepped forward, his expression determined. If you're looking for answers, you'll get them. But you should know that I'm just as much a victim in this as anyone else. The officers exchanged glances before nodding. We'll need formal statements from both of you. That evening, after the officers had left, Samuel gathered his parents in the living room. His voice was steady, but his eyes burned with resolve. I've made a decision, he announced. I'm stepping away from the family, from the company, from all of this. Emily gasped. Samuel, you can't mean that. I do, he said firmly. This family has been defined by lies and manipulation for too long. I need to find out who I am, without all of this weighing me down. Alexander's expression softened. Samuel, I know we've made mistakes, but running away won't solve anything. Samuel shook his head. I'm not running. I'm starting over. I'll figure out how to make things right in my own way. True to his word, Samuel began distancing himself from the family and the company. He moved into a modest apartment in the city, determined to build a life that was entirely his own. He took a job at a local nonprofit organization, helping underprivileged families, a stark contrast to the life of luxury he had known. Lucy visited often, their relationship growing stronger as they bonded over their shared desire for redemption. She encouraged Samuel to channel his anger and frustration into something positive. You have the power to make a difference, she told him one evening as they walked through the park. Use it. Back at the mansion, the tension between Alexander and Emily reached a breaking point. Alexander buried himself in work, desperate to salvage what was left of Morgan Enterprises. Emily, meanwhile, struggled with guilt and regret, feeling the weight of her son's absence keenly. One night, as she sat alone in the dining room, she found herself flipping through an old photo album. The images of a younger Samuel, full of life and laughter, brought tears to her eyes. We've lost him, she whispered to herself. As the weeks passed, a new twist emerged. Samuel received another encrypted email, this time containing a video file. The footage showed a secret meeting between Ernest Morgan and a shadowy figure, their conversation hinting at deeper corruption within the company. Samuel shared the video with Lucy, who immediately recognized the figure. That's Richard Foster, she said, her voice laced with shock. Samuel's eyes widened. Richard? He's been working for my father for years. Why would he? He's been hiding something, Lucy said. And I think it's time we found out what. Determined to uncover the full truth, Samuel and Lucy confronted Richard at his downtown office. The confrontation was heated, with Richard denying any wrongdoing at first. But when Samuel showed him the video, his facade crumbled. You don't understand, Richard said, his voice desperate. I was trying to protect the company, to protect your family. By lying? By covering up crimes? Samuel shot back. How many more secrets are you hiding, Richard? Richard hesitated, his face pale. There's one more thing, but you're not going to like it. The tension in the room was palpable, as Samuel and Lucy braced themselves for yet another revelation. The air in the Morgan mansion was thick with tension. The walls, which once echoed with laughter and grandeur, now seemed to close in, suffocating its inhabitants with the weight of revelations, betrayals, and looming consequences. Alexander, Emily, and Samuel were caught in a web of lies, spun over decades, and the truth, though finally surfacing, threatened to dismantle everything they held dear. Alexander sat in his study, a glass of untouched whiskey in his hand. His usually sharp and calculating demeanor was replaced by an air of defeat. On his desk lay a pile of legal documents, financial reports, and media clippings, all pointing to the unraveling of Morgan Enterprises. The television in the corner of the room blared with the latest news update. Morgan Enterprises faces scrutiny as evidence of decades-long financial misconduct comes to light. Authorities are investigating allegations of money laundering and corporate fraud. Alexander turned it off, unable to bear the judgmental tone of the anchor. A soft knock on the door broke his thoughts. "Come in," he said gruffly. Emily entered, her face etched with worry. "The lawyers called. They said the board is demanding answers. Alexander, what are we going to do?" He sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. "We fight. We salvage what we can." Emily approached him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "And Samuel? He's distancing himself more every day. We're losing him." Alexander's jaw tightened. He made his choice. "We have bigger problems to deal with." Meanwhile, in his modest apartment, Samuel sat at his laptop, reviewing the video file Lucy had uncovered. His heart pounded as he replayed the footage of his grandfather, Ernest Morgan, meeting with Richard Foster. What were they hiding? He muttered to himself. Lucy sat across from him, her expression equally troubled. "This goes deeper than we thought. If Richard was involved with your grandfather's dealings, he might still be covering something up." Samuel nodded, his resolve hardening. "Then we need to expose him, whatever it takes." The next day, Samuel and Lucy arrived unannounced at Richard's suburban estate. The sprawling property, with its meticulously manicured lawn and imposing gates, seemed to mock Samuel's own modest living arrangements. Richard answered the door, his face a mixture of surprise and unease. "Samuel, Lucy, what are you doing here?" Samuel pushed past him into the ground foyer. "We need to talk. Now." Richard led them to his study, closing the door behind them. "I don't know what this is about, but I—" "Cut the act," Samuel interrupted, pulling out his laptop and playing the video. The color drained from Richard's face as he watched. "I can explain," Richard stammered. "Then start talking," Lucy demanded. "Why were you meeting with Ernest? What were you hiding?" Richard sank into his chair, running a hand through his hair. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. I was young, ambitious. Your grandfather offered me a deal, help him move funds, and I'd secure a future in the company." Samuel's fists clenched. "You betrayed us." "I thought I was protecting the company," Richard said defensively, "but over time, it spiraled out of control. Your father suspected something, but never had proof, and now it's all coming to light." Lucy leaned forward. "Is there more? What aren't you telling us?" Richard hesitated, then opened a drawer, pulling out a stack of papers. "These are all the transactions I was involved in. It's everything." The revelations from Richard added fuel to the firestorm engulfing Morgan Enterprises. The authorities, already circling the company, intensified their investigation. Subpoenas were issued, accounts frozen, and board members began resigning in droves. In a high-rise office overlooking the city, the Morgan family's legal team gathered for an emergency meeting. The lead attorney, a no-nonsense woman named Margaret Hayes, laid out the situation. "The evidence against Morgan Enterprises is damning," she said. "If we don't act quickly, the company will collapse." Alexander, seated at the head of the table, remained silent, his face a mask of stone. Emily, sitting beside him, spoke up. "What are our options?" Margaret adjusted her glasses. "Cooperation. If we provide the authorities with everything we have, it might mitigate the damage." Samuel, who had joined the meeting reluctantly, shook his head. "Cooperation? You mean throw the family under the bus?" "It's not about blame, Mr. Morgan," Margaret replied. "It's about survival." As the family debated their next steps, Samuel found himself increasingly disillusioned with their priorities. One evening, he confronted his father in the study. "All you care about is saving the company," Samuel said, his voice filled with frustration. "But what about saving this family?" Alexander looked up from his desk, his eyes weary. "The company is the family, Samuel. Without it, we have nothing." "No, Dad," Samuel shot back. "Without trust, we have nothing." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. For the first time, Alexander seemed to falter, his usual confidence replaced by doubt. In the midst of the chaos, Samuel stumbled upon another piece of the puzzle. While sorting through old family records, he discovered a letter from his grandfather to his father. The letter, dated decades earlier, hinted at a secret offshore account linked to Ernest's illicit activities. Samuel showed the letter to Lucy, who immediately recognized its significance. "If we can trace this account, we might uncover the full extent of the corruption." The discovery reignited Samuel's determination. Together, he and Lucy began piecing together the financial trail, uncovering a labyrinth of shell companies and hidden assets. Their investigation led them to a shocking conclusion. The offshore account was still active, and large sums of money had been moved recently. The transactions were traced back to a single name, Sarah Parker. Samuel stared at the screen, his mind racing. "Sarah? She's been working with my father for years. Why would she?" Lucy placed a hand on his shoulder. "There's only one way to find out." As they prepared to confront Sarah, the weight of their discovery loomed large. The legacy of the Morgan family was crumbling, and the truth, once fully revealed, promised to change everything. The Morgan mansion, once a symbol of power and wealth, now stood as a monument to the family's crumbling legacy. A sense of urgency filled the air as Alexander, despite his deteriorating health, prepared for what he knew would be his final act of redemption. His son, Samuel, had unearthed the truth about the family's dark history, and the weight of decades of deceit now rested heavily on Alexander's shoulders. In the dimly lit study, Alexander sat hunched over his desk, pen in hand. The flickering light of a nearby lamp cast long shadows on the walls. His breathing was labored, but his determination was unwavering. Before him lay an unfinished letter to Samuel, his final attempt to explain, to apologize, and to offer a path forward. "My dearest Samuel," he wrote, pausing to steady his trembling hand. "I have made many mistakes, but the greatest of them all was losing your trust. You deserved a father who was honest, who was strong enough to face the truth. I failed you in so many ways, but I hope that one day you will understand why I did what I did." Tears blurred his vision as he continued writing. He poured his heart into the letter, recounting the sacrifices he had made and the guilt that had haunted him since Samuel's adoption. It was a confession, a plea for forgiveness, and a declaration of love all in one. Meanwhile, Samuel and Lucy sat in a small cafe in downtown Manhattan, their conversation hushed and intense. On the table between them lay the documents they had uncovered about Sarah Parker's secret offshore accounts. The betrayal was staggering. "She's been siphoning money for years," Lucy said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't just about your family anymore, Samuel. This could bring down the entire company." Samuel nodded, his jaw clenched. "We need to confront her, but we have to be smart. If she's been hiding this, there's no telling what else she's capable of." As they planned their next move, the door to the cafe opened, and a familiar figure walked in. Detective Jack Stone. The no-nonsense detective had been assigned to investigate Morgan Enterprises, and his presence immediately heightened the tension. "Mind if I join you?" Stone asked, pulling up a chair without waiting for an answer. "I've been following your investigation, and I think we're after the same thing." Samuel exchanged a wary glance with Lucy. And what exactly are you after, Detective? The truth, Stone replied, his tone unyielding. And from what I've seen, you're the only one in your family willing to face it. Later that evening, Samuel, Lucy, and Detective Stone arrived unannounced at Sarah's apartment. The tension was palpable as they waited for her to answer the door. When she finally appeared, her usually composed demeanor faltered at the sight of them. "Samuel," she began, her voice tinged with nervousness. "What's going on?" "We know, Sarah," Samuel said, holding up the documents. "About the accounts. About the money you've been hiding." Sarah's face turned ashen. "I can explain," she stammered, stepping aside to let them in. As they sat in her living room, Sarah revealed a story that shocked them all. She admitted to moving the money, but claimed it was to protect the company from Ernest Morgan's lingering debts and potential legal fallout. "I was trying to save the company," she insisted, "to save your family's legacy." Samuel's anger flared. "By stealing from us? By lying to us?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't know what else to do. Your father, he trusted me to handle things, and I thought I was doing what was best." As the truth about Sarah's actions came to light, the family prepared for what would be the final board meeting of Morgan Enterprises. The meeting was crucial, not only for the company's survival, but also for Alexander's attempt at redemption. Despite his declining health, Alexander insisted on attending. With the help of Emily and Samuel, he entered the boardroom, his presence commanding as ever. The room fell silent as he addressed the board members, many of whom had already lost faith in his leadership. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alexander began, his voice steady despite his frailty, "I stand before you today, not as your leader, but as a man who has made mistakes, grave mistakes. I take full responsibility for the actions that have brought us to this point. But I am here to tell you that this company, our legacy, can still be saved." He presented a plan for restructuring the company, including selling off non-essential assets and cooperating fully with authorities. He also proposed appointing Samuel as the new CEO, a move that shocked everyone in the room. "Samuel has the integrity and the vision to lead this company into a new era," Alexander said, his voice filled with conviction. "He is the future of Morgan Enterprises." After the meeting, Alexander and Samuel shared a rare moment of vulnerability. They stood on the balcony of the Morgan mansion, the city lights stretching out before them. "I'm proud of you, son," Alexander said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've shown a strength I could only dream of." Samuel looked at his father, the anger and resentment in his heart slowly giving way to something softer. "I'm not doing this for the company, Dad. I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do." Alexander placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "That's all I've ever wanted for you." As the family began to rebuild, a new piece of evidence emerged, an old ledger hidden in Ernest Morgan's study. The ledger contained details of a secret partnership between Ernest and an international crime syndicate, implicating him in crimes far worse than anyone had imagined. The discovery sent shockwaves through the family once again, but this time they faced it together. Alexander, Samuel, and Emily vowed to expose the truth, no matter the cost. In the closing moments of the chapter, Alexander, now bedridden, handed Samuel the letter he had written. With tears streaming down his face, Samuel read his father's heartfelt words, finally understanding the depth of his love and regret. As Alexander took his final breaths, surrounded by his family, he found peace in the knowledge that his son would carry on his legacy. Not the legacy of lies and corruption, but one of honesty and integrity. The chapter ends with Samuel standing at the helm of Morgan Enterprises, ready to lead the company into a brighter future, his father's words echoing in his mind. The truth is the greatest legacy you can leave behind. The morning sun filtered through the sheer curtains of the Morgan mansion, casting a soft golden glow over the once grand estate. The house was unnervingly quiet, as though holding its breath in the aftermath of the revelations that had shattered its foundations. Samuel sat at the long dining table, staring at a steaming cup of coffee he had no intention of drinking. Across from him, Lucy fiddled with her phone, her unease palpable. "Are you okay?" Lucy finally broke the silence, her voice tentative. Samuel didn't look up. "I don't know, Lucy," he said, after a long pause. "Everything I thought I knew about my family, it's all a lie." Lucy reached out, resting her hand on his. "You're not alone in this. Whatever happens next, I'm here." Samuel nodded, but the shadows in his eyes betrayed a storm of emotions too complex to articulate. Just as the tension in the room threatened to suffocate them, Samuel's phone buzzed. The caller ID displayed an unknown number. He hesitated before answering. "Hello? Samuel Morgan?" A gruff voice on the other end asked. "Yes. Who is this?" "This is Detective Jack Stone. We've uncovered new evidence regarding your family's business dealings. We need you to come to the station immediately." Samuel's grip on the phone tightened. "What evidence?" "It's better if we discuss this in person," the detective replied. "Bring anyone else who might have information." Samuel hung up, his face pale. "That was Detective Stone. He wants me to come to the station." Lucy frowned. "Do you think it's about the offshore accounts?" Samuel shook his head. "I don't know, but something tells me this is bigger than I thought." At the police station, Samuel and Lucy were led into a dimly lit conference room where Detective Stone waited, flanked by a team of officers. On the table lay a series of documents and photographs. "Mr. Morgan," Stone began, "we've been investigating your family's company for months, but recent discoveries have changed the scope of this case." Stone slid a photograph across the table. It was an image of Ernest Morgan, Alexander's father, shaking hands with a man Samuel didn't recognize. "This is your grandfather," Stone explained. "And this man is Anton Volkov, a known figure in international crime syndicates. We have reason to believe Morgan Enterprises was built on money laundered through Volkov's network." Samuel's stomach churned. "What does this have to do with me?" Stone leaned forward. "Everything. As the potential heir to Morgan Enterprises, you're now at the center of an investigation that could take down one of the largest crime networks in the country." Back at the mansion, Emily sat in the study, poring over old family records. Her hands trembled as she flipped through the pages of an aged ledger, its yellowed pages filled with names, dates, and cryptic notations. Her heart sank as she realized what it meant. "This is it," she whispered to herself. "The proof of everything." Just then, Sarah entered the room. Her normally composed demeanor was replaced by visible strain. "What are you doing with that?" Sarah demanded, her voice sharp. Emily held the ledger up. "Is this why you've been moving money offshore? To cover up Ernest's dealings?" Sarah's face darkened. "You don't understand, Emily. If this gets out, it will destroy everything." "It's already destroyed," Emily snapped. "The company, the family, Alexander. Everything is falling apart because of these secrets." Later that evening, Samuel returned to the mansion, his mind racing with the weight of what he'd learned. Emily and Sarah were waiting for him in the living room, the tension between them thick enough to cut with a knife. "We need to talk," Samuel said, his voice firm. "So do we," Emily replied, holding up the ledger. "This changes everything." Samuel glanced at the ledger, then back at his mother. "Detective Stone called me to the station today. He showed me a photo of Grandpa Ernest with a crime boss. Is it true? Did he really launder money through the company? Emily's silence spoke volumes. Sarah, however, stepped forward. Yes, Sarah admitted. Ernest Morgan used Morgan Enterprises as a front for illegal activities. Alexander didn't know at first, but when he found out, he chose to look the other way. Samuel felt as if the ground had been pulled out from under him. And you? Did you help him? I kept the books clean, Sarah confessed. I thought I was protecting the family, but I see now I was just as complicit. As the truth unraveled, Samuel realized he was standing at a crossroads. He could walk away from the family and its legacy of deceit, or he could confront it head-on and fight to rebuild something better. I'm done with lies, Samuel said, his voice steady but resolute. If this family is going to survive, we need to come clean about everything. Emily and Sarah exchanged a look, then nodded in agreement. It was time to face the consequences of their actions. The family gathered in the study to draft a plan. Alexander, though frail, insisted on being part of the discussion. He sat in his wheelchair, his gaze sharper than it had been in days. We need to cooperate with the authorities, Alexander said. If we're honest and transparent, they might show leniency. Samuel nodded. And we need to use the company's remaining resources to make amends. Fund charities, support whistleblower protections, whatever it takes to right the wrongs of the past. The next morning, the family made their way to the police station, armed with the ledger and a new sense of purpose. Detective Stone was waiting for them, his expression unreadable. We're ready to cooperate, Samuel said, handing over the ledger. Whatever it takes to fix this, we'll do it. Stone studied them for a moment before nodding. You're making the right choice. The Morgan mansion bustled with unusual activity as the family braced themselves for the impending fallout. Samuel sat in the study. A sea of documents spread out before him. Each paper detailed a new aspect of Morgan Enterprises' dubious history. Offshore accounts, shell companies, and connections to international crime syndicates. I don't even know where to start, Samuel admitted, rubbing his temples in frustration. Lucy, seated across from him, offered a reassuring smile. One step at a time. We expose the corruption, cooperate with the authorities, and start rebuilding. It's going to take time, but you're not alone in this. Samuel nodded, grateful for her unwavering support. Despite the chaos surrounding them, he felt a sense of purpose beginning to take root. Meanwhile, in his bedroom, Alexander sat propped up against a mountain of pillows, a laptop perched on his lap. His health had continued to decline, but his determination remained unshaken. He scrolled through emails and legal documents, his expression a mixture of guilt and resolve. Emily entered the room, carrying a tray of tea. You should rest, Alexander. You're pushing yourself too hard. There's no time to rest, Alexander replied. I've made too many mistakes, Emily. This is my chance to make things right. She set the tray down and sat beside him, her gaze softening. We're in this together. Whatever happens, we'll face it as a family. The next day, Samuel and Lucy arrived at the headquarters of Morgan Enterprises. The once pristine building now bore the weight of scandal, with reporters crowding the entrance and employees casting wary glances. Inside, they met Detective Jack Stone, who had agreed to oversee the company's transition into transparency. Mr. Morgan, Stone greeted, extending a hand. I appreciate your cooperation. This isn't going to be easy, but it's the right thing to do. Samuel shook his hand firmly. I just want to make sure the truth comes out and that the company can serve a better purpose moving forward. Stone nodded, gesturing toward the conference room. Let's get started. We'll go over the evidence you've provided and strategize the next steps. As the meeting progressed, Samuel found himself grappling with the enormity of his family's misdeeds. The revelations were staggering: embezzlement, tax fraud, and even indirect ties to human trafficking through third-party contractors. "How did it get this bad?" Samuel asked, his voice heavy with disbelief. Stone sighed. "It's not uncommon for businesses of this scale to lose sight of ethics in pursuit of profit. But what matters now is what you do with this information." Samuel glanced at Lucy, who gave him an encouraging nod. "We'll do whatever it takes to make amends." Later that evening, Samuel decided to take a bold step. He drafted an open letter to the public, acknowledging the company's wrongdoings and pledging to use its resources for good. With Lucy's help, he carefully crafted every word, ensuring the message conveyed sincerity and accountability. The letter was published the next morning, making headlines across the country. While some criticized the family for their past actions, others applauded their willingness to take responsibility. Amidst the chaos, a surprising opportunity presented itself. An advocacy group focused on corporate accountability reached out to Samuel, offering their expertise in transforming Morgan Enterprises into a force for positive change. "We believe in second chances," said the group's director, Monica Hayes, during a video call. "Your story could inspire other companies to prioritize ethics over profits." Samuel agreed to collaborate, marking the first step toward rebuilding the company's reputation. Back at the mansion, the family gathered for dinner, a rare moment of unity amidst the turmoil. Alexander, though frail, insisted on joining them, his presence a reminder of their shared commitment to redemption. "I know I don't have much time left," Alexander said, his voice steady despite its weakness. "But seeing all of you come together gives me hope that the Morgan name can stand for something good again." Samuel raised his glass, a determined look in his eyes. "To rebuilding, not just the company but ourselves." The clinking of glasses echoed through the dining room, a small but meaningful symbol of their resolve. The following week, Samuel stood before the board of directors, prepared to present his plan for the company's future. The atmosphere was tense, with many board members skeptical of his ability to lead amidst the scandal. "Ladies and gentlemen," Samuel began, his voice unwavering, "I understand your concerns, but this is not the time to shy away from accountability. This is our chance to set a new standard, one that prioritizes transparency, integrity, and social responsibility." He outlined his vision, which included divesting from corrupt ventures, funding community programs, and implementing strict ethical guidelines. To his relief, the board voted in favor of the plan, albeit with reservations. To demonstrate their commitment to change, Samuel and the board organized a public event to announce the company's new initiatives. The highlight of the event was a donation of $50 million to support victims of corporate exploitation, a gesture that resonated deeply with the community. As Samuel delivered his speech, he felt a sense of pride he hadn't experienced before. For the first time, he was using his platform to make a genuine difference. In his final days, Alexander penned a heartfelt letter to Samuel, expressing his pride and regret. The letter was a mixture of advice, apologies, and encouragement, encapsulating the lessons Alexander had learned too late. "I may not have been the father you deserved," Alexander wrote, "but I hope I've given you the tools to be a better man than I ever was." Samuel read the letter late one night, tears streaming down his face. It was a poignant reminder of the journey they had undertaken together, a journey fraught with pain, but also filled with moments of redemption. Samuel sat in his late father's study, a room filled with remnants of a bygone era, leather-bound books, antique globes, and old photographs. One picture caught his eye: a young Alexander with Ernest Morgan, his stern father. The image was a stark reminder of the generational pressures that had shaped their family. "Dad," Samuel whispered to himself, "I promise I'll do better." The next morning, Samuel stood before a packed auditorium, addressing Morgan Enterprises employees. It was the first company-wide meeting since the scandal broke. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "I know these past months have been challenging for all of us. But today, we're not here to dwell on the past. We're here to chart a new course." He unveiled a comprehensive plan for the company's transformation, including partnerships with nonprofits, a focus on sustainable business practices, and a pledge to support communities harmed by corporate exploitation. The room erupted in applause, a sign that Samuel's vision resonated with the workforce. For the first time in years, hope flickered within the walls of Morgan Enterprises. Lucy, who had recently joined the company as Director of Corporate Social Responsibility, was instrumental in implementing these changes. Her first project was organizing a charity drive to support families affected by corporate fraud. "We're not just writing checks," Lucy explained during a team meeting. "We're showing up for these communities, listening to their needs, and working alongside them to rebuild." Her passion and dedication inspired the team, and soon, Morgan Enterprises' public image began to shift from scandal to redemption. One of the first beneficiaries of the company's new initiatives was a small neighborhood devastated by Ernest Morgan's past dealings. Samuel personally visited the area, meeting with residents and listening to their stories. "This isn't just about repairing buildings," Samuel told them. "It's about rebuilding trust." During the visit, he met Mrs. Harris, a retired schoolteacher who had lost her home to one of the company's predatory loans. She held his hand tightly, her voice quivering with emotion. "Thank you for coming. It means more than you know." Samuel nodded, feeling the weight of her gratitude. "We owe it to you." Not everyone welcomed the changes with open arms. Several board members voiced concerns about the financial viability of Samuel's plans. "We're a business, not a charity," one member argued during a heated board meeting. Samuel stood his ground. "We can be both. A profitable company with a conscience is not only possible, it's necessary. If we lose sight of our responsibility to society, then we lose everything." The debate was intense, but Samuel's resolve won out. The board voted narrowly to continue with the reforms. That evening, Samuel returned to the mansion, emotionally drained. Lucy found him sitting on the balcony, staring at the city lights. "You did well today," she said, handing him a cup of tea. Samuel sighed. "It doesn't feel like enough. There's so much damage to undo." She placed a reassuring hand on his. "Change takes time. You're laying the foundation for something great." Her words comforted him, and for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to relax. While sorting through Alexander's belongings, Samuel discovered an old envelope addressed to him. Inside was a letter dated years before, written by his father. "Dear Samuel," it began, "if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer there to guide you. But I want you to know how proud I am of the man you've become. I made many mistakes, but my greatest joy was being your father. Carry the Morgan name with integrity and courage." The letter brought tears to Samuel's eyes, renewing his determination to honor his father's wishes. As news of Morgan Enterprises' transformation spread, public sentiment began to shift. Social media was abuzz with stories of the company's community projects and ethical reforms. "I never thought I'd say this," one tweet read, "but Morgan Enterprises might actually be the good guys now." Samuel's inbox was flooded with messages from people inspired by his leadership. Each one strengthened his resolve to continue the fight for change. Despite the progress, Samuel faced a tough choice: whether to sell off one of the company's most profitable divisions, which had ties to past corruption. "It's a major revenue stream," Richard, now an advisor to Samuel, argued. "Losing it could jeopardize everything." Samuel shook his head. "Keeping it would mean compromising our values. We can't move forward while holding on to the past." The board reluctantly agreed, and the division was sold, marking a symbolic break from the company's tainted history. In a public ceremony, Samuel unveiled the Alexander Morgan Foundation, dedicated to supporting ethical business practices and community development. "This foundation isn't just about my father's name," Samuel said during his speech. "It's about ensuring that no family, no community, ever suffers because of corporate greed." The event was attended by employees, community leaders, and even former critics of the company. It was a moment of unity and hope, symbolizing the dawn of a new era. Back at the mansion, Samuel, Emily, and Lucy shared a quiet dinner. The tension that had once defined their relationships was replaced by a sense of camaraderie. "I think he'd be proud of us," Emily said, raising her glass in a toast to Alexander. Samuel smiled. "I think he would." As dawn broke over the city, the Morgan family prepared for a pivotal day that would reshape their legacy. The Alexander Morgan Foundation's inaugural conference was scheduled to take place in a grand hall, filled with business leaders, community advocates, and the media. Samuel stood before his bedroom mirror, adjusting his tie. His reflection revealed a man transformed, not just in appearance, but in resolve. Lucy appeared in the doorway, her presence a calming force. "You ready?" she asked, a soft smile playing on her lips. Samuel nodded, his jaw set with determination. "It's time." The conference hall buzzed with energy. Attendees filled the ornate space, their murmurs echoing beneath the high ceilings. Large banners displayed the foundation's motto, "Legacy through Integrity." Emily sat in the front row, her hands clasped tightly. Though her name wasn't on the marquee, she had poured her heart into helping Samuel prepare. She glanced at the reserved seat beside her, a bittersweet smile crossing her face. Alexander's absence was palpable. As Samuel stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. He took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping across the audience. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady. "Today isn't just about the Morgan family. It's about all of us, about rebuilding trust, acknowledging past mistakes, and striving for a better future." His words resonated deeply, and the audience broke into applause. After his speech, the floor opened for questions. A journalist stood, his expression skeptical. "Mr. Morgan, how can we trust a family that has been at the center of such controversy?" Samuel met his gaze evenly. "That's a fair question. Trust isn't built overnight, and I don't expect it to be. All I can do is lead by example and ensure our actions speak louder than words." Lucy watched from the sidelines, her heart swelling with pride. Samuel's transparency was disarming, even to his harshest critics. As the conference progressed, Samuel unveiled a groundbreaking initiative, the Morgan Community Investment Fund. The fund would provide grants to small businesses and nonprofits focused on education, healthcare, and sustainability. "This isn't charity," Samuel explained. "It's an investment in people, in communities, and in a future where everyone has a chance to thrive." The announcement was met with a standing ovation, signaling a turning point for Morgan Enterprises' public image. After the conference, Samuel retreated to a quiet room backstage. He found Emily sitting alone, staring at a photograph of Alexander that she'd brought along. "He'd be proud of you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Samuel sat beside her. "I hope so. I just wish he could see this." Emily placed a hand on his. He does. In every choice you make, in every step forward, he's with you. Despite the conference's success, challenges loomed. Back at the company, Samuel faced resistance from a group of veteran executives who were unhappy with the new direction. This isn't what Morgan Enterprises was built for, one of them argued during a tense board meeting. We're alienating our core investors. Samuel stood his ground. If those investors can't support our vision, then perhaps they're not the right partners for us. The statement was met with stunned silence, but Samuel's conviction was unshakable. One of the executives, an older woman named Margaret Daniels, approached Samuel after the meeting. "You remind me of your father," she said, her tone warm. "But in the best ways. Alexander always had a fire in him, even when he was wrong. You've got that same fire, but with a clearer purpose." Her support proved instrumental in winning over other board members. Meanwhile, Lucy continued to shine in her new role. She organized a series of community workshops, bringing together residents, activists, and business leaders to discuss shared goals. During one such event, a young boy approached her with a handmade card that read, "Thank you for helping my mom." Lucy knelt to his level, her heart full. "Your mom is amazing. She inspires me." Samuel observed from a distance, his admiration for Lucy deepening. That evening, he surprised her with a quiet dinner, a rare moment of respite in their hectic lives. Late one night, Samuel found himself alone in the mansion's study. He opened a journal Alexander had kept, its pages filled with musings and advice. One entry caught his eye. "The greatest legacy isn't wealth or power. It's the impact we leave on the lives of others." Those words became a mantra, guiding Samuel through the challenges ahead. Just as things seemed to be stabilizing, Samuel received a call from Richard, who was still facing legal proceedings. "There's a new development," Richard said, his voice tense. "Someone's trying to block the Foundation's initiatives. I think it's an old rival of your father's." Samuel's stomach tightened. The past wasn't finished with them yet. Samuel, Lucy, and Margaret worked together to uncover the source of the interference. Their investigation led them to a shadowy figure tied to Ernest Morgan's old dealings. "This is a reminder," Lucy said, her tone serious. "The past doesn't just disappear." Samuel nodded. "Then we face it head on." Amid the turmoil, Samuel received another surprise. A letter from Alexander, delivered posthumously by the family lawyer. "Samuel," it read, "if you're reading this, it means you're taking the lead I always knew you would. Never forget, the name Morgan is yours to redefine. Make it stand for something worth believing in." The letter brought tears to Samuel's eyes, rekindling his resolve. Despite the interference, the Morgan Community Investment Fund officially launched, with overwhelming support. The inaugural grants went to small businesses in underserved areas, each chosen for their potential to create lasting change. During the celebratory event, Samuel stood with Lucy, Emily, and Margaret by his side. The moment felt like a culmination of everything they had fought for. "This is just the beginning," Samuel said in his speech. "Together, we're proving that change is possible, even for a family like ours." That evening, back at the mansion, the family gathered for a quiet toast. The past year had been tumultuous, but they had emerged stronger. "To Dad," Samuel said, raising his glass, "and to the future he inspired us to create." The clinking of glasses echoed in the room, a symbol of unity and hope. As Samuel gazed out at the city skyline, Lucy joined him. "What's next?" she asked. He smiled, a rare moment of contentment. "Whatever it takes to keep moving forward." Together, they faced the horizon, ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. The morning sun rose over New York City, casting a golden glow on the towering Morgan Enterprises building. Its sleek facade, once a symbol of power built on secrets, now represented transparency and transformation under Samuel's leadership. Inside the building, the air buzzed with excitement. Today marked the one-year anniversary of the Alexander Morgan Foundation, an initiative that had grown beyond anyone's expectations. Samuel, dressed in a tailored navy suit, stood in the lobby surrounded by colleagues and community leaders. His once uncertain demeanor had been replaced with confidence, honed through trials and victories. "Mr. Morgan," Lucy said, approaching him with a clipboard in hand. "The press conference is ready. Are you?" He nodded. "Let's do this." The conference room filled quickly with reporters, investors, and employees. The crowd reflected the diversity Samuel had worked tirelessly to foster within the company. A giant banner behind the stage read, "Morgan Enterprises, Building a Future Together." Samuel stepped up to the podium, his gaze sweeping the room. "Good morning, everyone," he began. "Today isn't just about celebrating the past year. It's about looking forward. Morgan Enterprises is no longer the company it once was. We've redefined our purpose, not just to create profit, but to create impact." He detailed new initiatives, including sustainable business practices, employee equity programs, and a global partnership with nonprofits to tackle education inequities. The audience broke into applause, their enthusiasm a testament to Samuel's hard-earned trust. From the audience, Emily watched her son with pride. Her own journey of redemption had been challenging. After facing legal scrutiny for her role in the family's hidden past, she had committed herself to community service, spending months working with at-risk youth. The experience had humbled her and given her a new perspective on the privilege she once took for granted. During the reception that followed, Emily approached Samuel. "You've turned this company into something extraordinary," she said. Samuel smiled. "It's not just me, Mom. It's everyone, Lucy, Margaret, and even you. You taught me resilience." Tears welled in Emily's eyes. "I just hope I've done enough to earn your forgiveness." Samuel embraced her. "You have, Mom, and you've earned mine." Amid the celebration, a familiar face reappeared, Richard Foster. He had completed his reduced sentence for financial misconduct and returned with a renewed sense of purpose. Nervous but determined, he approached Samuel. "Samuel," Richard began, "I don't deserve a second chance, but I wanted to thank you for everything you've done, for not giving up on the company, even when I failed it." Samuel extended a hand. "Everyone deserves a second chance, Richard. If you're ready to help us build something better, I'd be glad to have you back." Richard nodded, his gratitude evident. Later that evening, Lucy surprised Samuel with a private unveiling of a new project she had spearheaded, a mural in the heart of the city. It depicted Alexander Morgan holding the scales of justice in one hand and a tree of life in the other, symbolizing his journey from secrecy to transparency. As Samuel and Lucy stood before the mural, she said, "This is for him, and for you." Samuel turned to her, his eyes softening. "It's perfect. He would have loved it." Lucy smiled. "And what about you? Do you love it?" "I love everything about it," Samuel replied, taking her hand. Despite the success, not everything was resolved. A lingering lawsuit threatened to derail one of the foundation's largest initiatives. Samuel met with his legal team, where they revealed troubling evidence tying the plaintiff to old adversaries of his grandfather, Ernest Morgan. "This is more than a lawsuit," one of the lawyers said. "It's an attack on your legacy." Samuel's response was calm but firm. "Then we fight, not to protect the Morgan name, but to protect what it stands for now." While sorting through old files one evening, Samuel discovered a sealed envelope addressed to him. It was from Alexander, written shortly before his passing. Dear Samuel, if you're reading this, it means you've stepped into the role I always knew you were destined for. Leading isn't about being perfect. It's about being accountable. You've proven that already. My hope is that you'll continue to lead with courage and compassion. Remember, the name Morgan doesn't belong to me anymore. It belongs to you. Shape it into something the world can believe in. With all my love, Dad. The letter brought tears to Samuel's eyes. He placed it in a frame on his desk, a constant reminder of his father's faith in him. As the Foundation's anniversary gala approached, Samuel worked tirelessly to ensure it would be a night to remember. Held in a grand ballroom, the event featured a diverse lineup of speakers, from grassroots activists to global leaders. When Samuel took the stage to deliver the keynote address, he began with a story about Alexander. My father wasn't perfect, he admitted, but he taught me the most important lesson I've ever learned. It's never too late to change. And that's the message I want to share tonight. Change is hard, but it's possible for people, for families, and for companies. The crowd erupted into applause. As the evening wound down, Samuel and Lucy stepped outside for a moment of quiet reflection. The city sparkled around them, a reminder of both the challenges they had overcome and the opportunities ahead. What now? Lucy asked, leaning into him. Samuel looked out at the skyline, his heart full. Now, we keep building. For Dad, for the Foundation, for everyone who believed in us. The final scene returned to the Morgan mansion, now transformed into a community hub for the Foundation's work. Children played on the lawn, and families gathered in what was once a symbol of isolation and secrecy. Samuel stood at the top of the steps, watching the activity below. Lucy joined him, slipping her hand into his. We did it, she said softly. No, Samuel replied, his voice steady. We're just getting started. With that, the story of the Morgan family ended on a note of hope, redemption, and the promise of a brighter tomorrow. As the Morgan family steps into a new chapter of redemption and resilience, we're left with a powerful reminder. Life is full of twists and turns, but it's the courage to face the truth and rebuild that defines who we are. What would you do in Samuel's shoes? Could you forgive a lifetime of secrets for the chance to start anew? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective could spark a conversation that matters. And if this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. There's so much more ahead. New tales of human strength, redemption, and the choices that change lives forever. Join us on this journey, because every story deserves to be told. See you in the next one.